Hey everyone! In today's Halloween themed DIY, we're turning your average $7 door mirror into a spooky coffin shape. This project was inspired by a mirror I saw on Amazon when shopping for Halloween decorations, and I thought it would be a fun project to use some extra mirrors I had sitting around. I've literally never cut glass before and have very little woodworking experience, but I'm pretty ambitious, so let's see what happens. Materials linked in the description box below. Start by removing the frame from your target mirror. Make sure you are wearing gloves and protective eyewear from this, as the glass is more fragile than you might think. I already broke off one of the corners here trying to get the frame removed, as you can see in the video. I found that the easiest way to remove the frame is to gently tilt it backwards until the glue breaks, and then peel off any extra little cardboard pieces that are sticking out. The next thing I did was use painter's tape to mask off the size of the mirror that I wanted. I measured out about 8 inches from the top of the mirror and then 12 inches across as the widest part. The top of the mirror measured 5 inches, centered right in the middle, and the bottom of the mirror measured 4.5 across. The total height of the mirror was 22 inches. I used a Sharpie to draw out straight lines on the edges of the mirror, and I can use them as a guide to cut the mirror later. I used the painter's tape to mask off the sections of the mirror that are going to be cut off so that I can get a visual of what the mirror will look like once it's cut. If I didn't like any of the measurements, I would just remove the painter's tape and remark the lines and draw it out again until I was happy with the shape. Once it's time to put the mirror in the frame, the permanent marker can easily be removed with rubbing alcohol or acetone. And this is what the final shape of the mirror looked like before cutting. If you're new to glass cutting, make sure that you do a few practice cuts. Here I used the end of the mirror that I won't be using for the coffin shape to do my practice cuts. I found it difficult to hold the glass cutter in the right way while wearing my protective gloves, so I went ahead and took them off just to pull the glass cutter across. Make sure that you put your gloves back on to actually snap the glass in half if that's what you need to do. So here I'm using a tool just to etch a line straight across the glass. So this tool is not actually cutting into the glass much at all. It's really just etching a line. And then you go ahead and snap the glass. You can see I'm kind of tapping it a little bit there on that edge. That kind of helps the glass break apart. And then I fold it over the end of the table and it snaps apart like that. It really doesn't take more than a few practice cuts to get the hang of it. One thing that I did notice though is that it really helps if you are able to etch the glass in one straight line. If you try going back and forth across it like I'm doing right here, it ends up in a not so clean line. So what you really want to do is pull it once straight across, get a good etched line, and it snaps right off and clean for you. I did have a couple of tries where I left a little bit of the piece of the mirror hanging on. You can kind of see right there, it didn't really cut straight. And right about here, I'm trying to etch it again, and then in just a second, it's gonna snap off and ruin that side of the mirror. I still had quite a bit of mirror left though, so what I did was I redrew the coffin shape with the remaining part of the mirror that I had left, avoiding that broken cut line, and I was able to still cut out the entire coffin shape from that remaining piece of glass. Here I used a jewelry file to quickly sand the rough edges. This didn't make them entirely smooth, but it did remove the small shards left over from cutting. I covered the edges in painter's tape to make handling the mirror easier until it was ready to frame. Then it was time to make the frame. I measured each of the final edges and sketched out my cuts for the 1x2s. Initially, I cut the boards about 2 inches longer than they needed to be, so I had room to make the miter cuts. I added rabbet cuts to each board so the mirror had a place to sit, and so it would cover the raw edges in the mirror, similar to a picture frame. To make the rabbets, I lowered the blade to 1/2 inch and cut into each board at 1/4 inch. This made a small groove. Then I lowered the blade again to 1/4 inch, moved the rip guard to 1/2 inch, and passed the board through again. This resulted in a rabbet with 1/4 inch depth and 1/2 inch width. Using a bit of geometry, I calculated the angles needed for each miter cut. I did this by calculating the total angle of each corner, then dividing that by half to get the angle for each board. Since I don't have a miter saw and the miter gauge on my table saw is hard to get accurate, I decided to draw the miters on each board to help guide where I needed to cut. I thought this would be pretty simple, and it was once I got the right tools. After a few minutes of trying to get that to work with a speed square, I realized I really needed one of those things we use in the eye clinic that I always forget the name of, but a protractor would also work. So after a quick trip to Target, I got to work drawing the angles using a protractor. You can see here how the angles will line up with each other even before making the first cut. Before bringing these pieces over to the table saw, I double-checked all the calculations. You know that phrase they use in both woodworking and strabismus surgery, measure twice, cut once? Well, I thought I was doing that. Turns out I measured once, calculated twice, and cut once. Calculating twice won't do you any good if your measurements are off. You'll see where I messed up in just a second. Once at the table saw, I lined up all the angles I drew with the blade, locked the miter sled in place, and ran the board through. This worked out fairly well and was pretty easy. I used a bit of tape to dry fit the frame. You can see the bottom corner doesn't match up and the mirror is too long for the frame. After double checking everything, I found I had measured the bottom width of the mirror incorrectly. To fix it, I had to trim off a little of the mirror and cut a new bottom piece. Perfect fit. I glued the pieces together, taped them in place, and left it to dry overnight. The next morning, I filled any cracks or holes with wood putty and let it dry. Then it was time to sand. Or not. To hold the joints in place better, I got out my staple gun and added a few upholstery staples to each joint in addition to the glue. Then it was actually time to sand. I ran an orbital sander over the frame with 150 grit and 220 grit sandpaper. I added 2 coats of black paint to the entire frame and then used Minwax finishing wax on the front and sides of the mirror. While the finishing wax was drying, I cleaned off the mirror using acetone. I had a small amount of wood glue on the mirror that took a little work to come off, but the permanent marker came off super easily. I traced the mirror on a piece of cardboard to use as a spacer between the mirror and the back of the frame. Depending on the depth of your rabbet cuts in the frame, you may not need a spacer. If the mirror does not sit flush with the edge of the frame, use a spacer to make sure it stays snug and doesn't move around, which could cause the mirror to break. I traced the outside of the frame onto a piece of poster paper to use as a backing. When I cut this out, I made it just slightly smaller than the tracing so it would not hang over the edge of the frame. I used black poster paper for this, but you could also use a thin piece of cardboard or even another color. This will be hidden when the mirror is hanging. I used Gorilla Glue to attach the cardboard spacer to the back of the mirror. Once dry, I placed the mirror inside the frame and glued the paper backing in place. I used upholstery staples to hold the backing in place and give a cleaner finish. However, you could also glue the backing to the frame. Lastly, add a picture frame hanger if you would like to hang the mirror on a wall. I had so much fun making this mirror from scratch, and I'm extremely happy with how it turned out. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can learn from my mistakes along the way. Make sure to like, comment, and hit that subscribe button if you want more fun Halloween DIYs or just any DIYs in general. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Excuse me, what are you doing? Hey, you're in my video. Luna. Luna. Meow, meow. Meow, meow. Don't drink my coffee. You drinking my coffee?